My wife took off with her ex and my daughter called him her perfect dad, until I exposed who they truly were and crushed their fairy tale dream. My world shattered the moment my neighbor Michael called. He said there was a U-Haul in my driveway, and 3 guys were emptying my house in broad daylight, and my stomach dropped because I knew instantly this wasn't a robbery. I was sitting in my office, trying to focus on quarterly reports, but Michael's panic in my ear sent a chill down my spine. My first thought was that some crew had chosen a Tuesday afternoon to clean out everything Olivia and I had built over 8 years of marriage. I grabbed my keys, barked something about an emergency to my boss, and was out the door. The whole drive home, my hand was glued to my phone, redialing Olivia, but it just kept ringing, then straight to voicemail. I was doing 70 in a 45 zone, my mind racing, picturing our life, our memories, just gone. When I pulled onto our street, my blood ran cold. A massive moving truck blocked half the road. 3 men were carrying boxes and furniture out of my front door as if it were the most normal thing in the world. I slammed my car sideways across the driveway, blocking them in, ready to call the police. But then I saw her. Olivia was on the front porch, clipboard in hand, directing traffic like a professional coordinator. Next to her stood a man I'd never seen before, tall, dark hair, an expensive leather jacket. His hand was resting on the small of her back in a way that made my stomach churn. For a second, I just stood there, trying to process. This wasn't a robbery. This was something far, far worse. When Olivia looked up and saw me, there was no guilt, no surprise. Just pure annoyance, like I was an inconvenient interruption. Something in me snapped. I walked straight up to the stranger and shoved him, hard, sending him stumbling back into one of the movers. I was yelling, asking him who the hell he thought he was. He got right back in my face, telling me to calm down. That's when I threw a punch. It connected with his jaw with a sickening thud, and my knuckles screamed in pain. Suddenly, the movers were pulling us apart. Olivia was screaming. I was shouting for someone to call the police. When the officers arrived, I was on the curb, my hand throbbing. The other guy was holding an ice pack to his face. The officers separated us, asking questions, and that's when Olivia dropped the bomb that changed everything. She looked at the cop, her voice cold and flat, and said, "This is Caleb. He's my boyfriend, and we're moving my belongings out of this house." I actually laughed. It was so absurd, so impossible, the only sound my brain could produce was this hysterical, disbelieving laugh that made the officers look at me like I'd lost my mind. They explained to Olivia that she couldn't just take marital property without a court order. I watched her face turn crimson with rage as they instructed the movers to put everything back. Caleb tried to argue, but the police shut him down immediately. Eventually, he got into his BMW and sped away, leaving Olivia standing alone in the driveway, her failed escape attempt lying shattered around her. The police took our statements, then told us we looked like idiots and needed to get lawyers to do this properly. After everyone left, it was just Olivia and me in our living room. The silence was suffocating. She wouldn't look at me, just kept staring at her phone. I finally asked her how long this had been going on. She shrugged, utterly dismissive, and said it didn't matter, that she'd been unhappy for years and Caleb made her feel alive in a way I never had. I told her she could leave, but our daughter Chloe was staying with me. That's when Olivia smiled, a small, cruel smile, and said, I might want to talk to Chloe before making any decisions about custody. An hour later, Chloe came home from school. I was sitting at the kitchen table, trying to figure out what to say. But before I could even open my mouth, Chloe looked at me and said, "Oh, you found out about Caleb." The casual way she said it, like she was commenting on the weather, hit me like a physical blow. She sat down and explained that Mom had told her about Caleb 6 months ago. She'd even met him a few times when Mom picked her up from school. Mom had told Chloe he was her soulmate and that sometimes adults make mistakes and marry the wrong person. My 8-year-old daughter had been carrying this secret for half a year, looking at me every day, knowing our family was a lie. I asked Chloe if she understood what was happening. She nodded slowly, explaining that Mom had told her it would be better this way, that everyone would be happier. Then she said something I'll never forget. She looked me right in the eyes and said, "Mom says Caleb would be a perfect dad." And honestly, I think she might be right. The way she said it wasn't mean or cruel. It was just honest, like she'd thought about it carefully and come to a reasonable conclusion. I sat there, looking at this little girl I had raised, loved, and protected. I realized Olivia had already won, had already turned my own daughter against me without me even knowing there was a battle happening. That night, after Chloe went to bed, I sat alone in the dark living room and made a decision. If they wanted Caleb to be the perfect dad, if they wanted to act like I was just some obstacle, then fine. I'd give them exactly what they wanted. I'd step back and let them have their fairy tale. But I'd make damn sure that when it all fell apart, and it would fall apart, I'd be the one standing on solid ground. I twisted my wedding ring off my finger for the first time in 8 years and set it on the coffee table. Tomorrow, I'd walk into a lawyer's office and start the process of dismantling everything I'd built. Tomorrow, the war would begin. I'd make sure I fought it smarter than I'd ever fought anything in my life, because I'd already lost my wife and, apparently, my daughter, and I wasn't about to lose myself, too. The next morning, I walked into David's law office at 8 a.m. sharp. I'd barely slept, but I was running on pure adrenaline and rage. David took one look at my face and knew this wasn't going to be an amicable divorce. David had been my friend since college, and he'd built a reputation as the kind of lawyer who destroyed the opposition so completely they wished they'd never stepped into a courtroom. That's exactly what I needed. I laid out everything that had happened, the attempted move, Caleb, the fact that my own daughter had known about the affair for 6 months. David's expression shifted from sympathy to something that looked almost predatory. He asked me one simple question: did I want to be fair or did I want to win? I didn't hesitate. I wanted to win so badly that Olivia would regret ever thinking Caleb was a better option. David moved fast. By noon, we'd filed an emergency petition for divorce along with a motion to freeze all marital assets and prevent Olivia from removing anything else from the house. That afternoon, I went to our bank and withdrew every single dollar from our joint account except for $37. That was the exact amount Olivia had contributed in the past year while I'd been depositing my entire paycheck. The account had almost $40,000 in it, money I'd saved from my salary while Olivia spent her marketing job income on whatever she wanted. I went through every subscription we had: Netflix, Spotify, the gym membership, the meal delivery service. I canceled everything or removed her access. With each click, I felt my pain transform into cold, calculated action. I called my insurance company and removed Olivia from everything: health insurance, life insurance, beneficiary list, car insurance. I changed the passwords on every streaming service, every shared account. Each one felt like taking back a piece of myself. 2 days later, I got served with Olivia's petition demanding temporary spousal support and custody of Chloe. Her lawyer was asking for half of everything, including the house. The petition claimed I was unstable and had assaulted her boyfriend. 5 weeks later, we went to court for the temporary orders hearing. Olivia walked in with her attorney, a sharp-looking woman in an expensive suit who clearly thought she was going to steamroll some heartbroken husband. Right behind them was Caleb, in a suit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. Her lawyer laid out this whole sob story about how Olivia had sacrificed her career to support mine, how she deserved to maintain the lifestyle she'd become accustomed to, how the house should be considered marital property even though I bought it 2 years before we got married, and how I was dangerous. Then David stood up and methodically destroyed every single argument. He showed the judge the deed to the house with the purchase date clearly before our marriage. He showed our tax returns proving Olivia made almost as much as I did. He presented bank statements showing that I'd paid for literally everything while her income disappeared into personal spending. He even had the police report from the U-Haul incident, showing the officers had told Olivia she was in the wrong. The judge asked Olivia's lawyer if she had any evidence to contradict these documents. The silence in that courtroom was the sweetest sound I'd ever heard. The judge ruled that the house was my separate property. Our incomes were equal, so no temporary spousal support. All marital assets would remain frozen. Regarding custody, we'd need a formal evaluation, but for now, Chloe would stay primarily with me with supervised visits for Olivia at her parents' house. I watched Olivia's face go from confident to shocked to absolutely furious in 30 seconds flat. That night, I got a call from Olivia's mom asking if Chloe could stay with them for a few days because Olivia was having a hard time. Even though every instinct told me to say no, I agreed because I didn't want Chloe caught in the middle more than she already was. Over the next 2 months, Chloe spent most of her time at her grandparents' house, coming to stay with me on weekends. Every time I saw her, she seemed more distant, more confused. One Friday evening, when I picked Chloe up, she was quieter than usual. When we got back to my apartment, she finally said what had been bothering her. "Why can't I just live with Mom and Caleb? They're going to get a place together, and Caleb says I can have my own room with whatever decorations I want." Something in me just broke. I took a deep breath and said something I shouldn't have said to an 8-year-old. "You know what, Chloe? If that's what you want, then maybe that's what should happen. Maybe you should go be with your perfect new dad since I'm apparently not good enough anymore." The look on her face will haunt me forever. It was like I'd physically slapped her. She ran to her bedroom and slammed the door. I knocked and tried to apologize, but she wouldn't talk to me. The next morning, when her grandmother came to pick her up, Chloe asked if she could just stay there for a while. I watched my daughter leave with her overnight bag. I knew I had just pushed her away in the exact moment when I should have been holding on tighter. The next few weeks were the darkest of my life. I barely saw Chloe. Olivia's parents said she was upset and needed time. I was alone in my apartment, wondering how I'd managed to lose everything that mattered. But somewhere in that darkness, I made a decision. I wasn't going to keep playing defense. I was going to find out exactly who Caleb really was. I called David and asked for a recommendation for a private investigator. He gave me the name of Frank, who'd helped him on other divorce cases. I met with Frank at a coffee shop and laid out everything I knew about Caleb, which honestly wasn't much beyond the fact that he drove a BMW, wore expensive clothes, and had somehow convinced my wife to blow up our family for him. Frank said he'd have a preliminary report within 2 weeks. As I walked out, I felt like maybe I was about to level the playing field. Frank called me exactly 12 days later, and the tone in his voice told me he'd found something big. When we met at his office, he slid a manila folder across his desk, thick with documents. What he'd uncovered about Caleb was so much worse than I'd imagined. Caleb's entire life was basically a carefully constructed lie. Frank had found court records showing Caleb had been arrested twice in 3 years for violating restraining orders. Once in Michigan and once in Indiana, both filed by ex-girlfriends who claimed he'd become controlling and threatening when they tried to end things. The BMW was leased, and he was 3 months behind on payments. His fancy apartment was actually a sublet he was being evicted from. The high-level sales job was actually temp positions at car dealerships where he'd been fired for falsifying commission reports. Frank had even found social media posts from one ex, warning other women about Caleb. She described how he'd love-bombed her with gifts bought on credit cards he never intended to pay off. When she'd finally tried to leave, he'd shown up at her workplace and her parents' house, making scenes until she'd gotten a restraining order. The more I read, the more I realized Olivia had fallen for a con artist. Someone so good at playing the role that she'd never stopped to question whether any of it was real. I asked Frank if he was absolutely certain because I needed it ironclad. He assured me everything was documented with court records, credit reports obtained through legal channels, and statements from people who'd known Caleb. I called David, and he came over to review everything. After reading through the documents, he said, "This is exactly what we needed to file for an emergency custody modification. If Caleb was living with Olivia and Chloe at her parents' house, then my daughter was potentially in danger from a man with a documented history of threatening behavior." We filed the emergency motion the next morning with all of Frank's findings attached. The judge scheduled the hearing for 3 days later. David explained that when child safety is involved, courts move quickly. I hadn't spoken to Olivia in weeks beyond brief texts, so when I walked into that courtroom and saw her face go pale as David started presenting the evidence about Caleb, I almost felt bad for her. Almost, but not quite, because she'd chosen to expose our daughter to someone she'd never bothered to investigate. David methodically went through each arrest record, each eviction notice, each credit report showing tens of thousands in unpaid debt. With each document, Olivia seemed to shrink further into her chair. Her lawyer tried to argue that past relationships didn't indicate future behavior, but David countered that according to the pattern in the restraining orders, Caleb's behavior only escalated when women tried to leave him, which made the current situation particularly dangerous. The judge asked Olivia directly if she'd known about any of Caleb's history. She admitted in this small voice that she hadn't, that he told her he was divorced with no kids and a successful career. The judge then asked if Caleb was currently living with her and Chloe at her parents' house. Olivia hesitated before saying yes, that he'd moved in 2 weeks ago after having financial trouble. I watched the judge's expression harden. The judge ruled that effective immediately, Chloe would return to my primary custody. Olivia could have supervised visitation until she could prove Caleb was no longer in her life and she completed a parenting course. As we left the courtroom, Olivia was crying. I picked Chloe up from her grandparents' house that evening. Her grandmother pulled me aside and apologized. She told me something that made everything click. About a week after Olivia first told Chloe about Caleb 6 months ago, she'd overheard Olivia threatening Chloe in the bathroom, telling her that if she ever mentioned Caleb to me, Olivia would have to send Chloe away to live with distant relatives. It would be all Chloe's fault that the family broke up. Rage and guilt washed over me. Her grandmother said Chloe had been having nightmares lately, crying about how she'd ruined everything and how I didn't love her anymore. That's when I realized my daughter had never actually wanted Caleb to replace me. She'd just been trying to survive an impossible situation. I went inside and found Chloe sitting on the couch, looking small and scared. I sat down next to her and told her I knew everything now, that I knew about the threats and the secrets and how scared she must have been. I told her none of this was her fault, that I was so sorry for not protecting her sooner. She looked at me with tears streaming down her face. I never wanted Caleb to be my dad. I just wanted Mom to be happy so she wouldn't send me away. I held her while she sobbed out months of fear, confusion, and guilt. I promised her that nobody was ever going to send her away, that she was safe now, and we were going to get through this together. Over the next few weeks, Chloe started opening up about what life had been like with Caleb around. How he'd been nice at first, but then started getting angry when Olivia had to deal with custody stuff. How he'd punched a wall one night and how scared that had made her feel. I made sure she started seeing a therapist. Slowly, I watched my daughter start to come back to herself, start to smile again. About 6 weeks after the emergency custody hearing, Olivia's mom called with news I'd been half expecting. Caleb had been arrested in another state for violating the restraining order from his Indiana ex. He'd driven there after leaving town and showed up at her workplace. Olivia had finally kicked him out when she found out he'd been stealing her mother's credit cards. The fairy tale had come crashing down exactly like I'd known it would. Olivia tried to reach out a few times, leaving voicemails about how she'd made a terrible mistake, asking if we could talk about working things out, but I never returned her calls because that ship had sailed and sunk. The final divorce hearing happened 4 months later. By that point, Olivia had given up fighting and just wanted it over. We split the remaining assets fairly. I kept the house. Custody was formalized with Chloe living primarily with me and having visits with Olivia every other weekend once she completed her parenting classes. I'd gotten a promotion at work. With the raise, I was able to start putting money away for Chloe's college fund. I even started dating someone new about 6 months later, a woman named Emily, who I'd met at a work conference. The difference between her and Olivia was like night and day, because Emily had her own successful career, her own apartment, her own life that didn't require me to complete her. One Saturday morning, Chloe and I were making pancakes, and she asked me if I was happy now. Really, truly happy. I realized that for the first time in over a year, I could honestly say yes. I told her that I'd learned something important through all of this. That fairy tales aren't real, but new beginnings are. That sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away from people who don't appreciate what you bring to their lives. She smiled and said she was glad I didn't take her mom back. She liked who I was now. Someone who stood up for himself and for her. Someone who didn't let people treat him like he didn't matter. Looking back, I realized that the perfect dad Olivia had promised Chloe turned out to be a con artist with a criminal record. The great love story she'd blown up our family for turned out to be built on lies and debt. The stable, boring husband she'd thrown away turned out to be the only parent Chloe could actually count on. But the real lesson wasn't about Olivia or Caleb, or even about winning in divorce court. It was about teaching my daughter that your worth isn't determined by whether someone else chooses to see it. That sometimes losing everything you thought you wanted is actually the first step toward building something real. Chloe knows now that I'll always fight for her, that I'll always be the parent who shows up and does the hard work, even when it's not exciting or glamorous. And that's worth more than any fairy tale could ever be. What would you have done if you found out your partner was moving out everything you owned in broad daylight with a new person?